This new Hunter Void build allows your hunter to solo any activity in the game, whether that's a legend, master or grandmaster activity, even while massively underpowered like this master lost sector. Now although you can still die, this build will just make it so much easier as you'll have infinite invisibility, devour and extra weapon DPS, which will help you complete the activity you're trying to do. Now the only thing harder than this activity is a grandmaster nightfall, which as of making this video are currently not available, but this master lost sector features the attrition modifier, one of the most annoying ones of all, where you can't regen health naturally, so having this build really helps you survive situations that you really shouldn't be surviving. Now this video is sponsored by USMMO. If you're looking for cheaper Destiny 2 Silver on Steam, then be sure to check them out below along with my discount code. And now guys, get that void ready and let's get that infinite invisibility. Now firstly, as always, if you like these videos and you want to see more top fun and just purely amazing builds for this season, then you can find that full playlist link down below, and while you're there, why not leave a comment on what you think of this build or what you're going to use this build, because there are a lot of different ways you can use this build, but this is your updated Hunter's Void build for season 17. And the best part about this build is it doesn't rely heavily on seasonal mods like last season, so you will be able to use this as a base setup, meaning that you can use it in any season you want without any changes. Now you can use the base setup of this build and then change a few things slightly. So if you want to be the DPS god with your super, you can run the same setup but use an Orpheus Rig to get that third tether shot, allowing you to output some serious DPS. If you want to guarantee that invis, so you have infinite invisibility, then you can run things like a 6 Coyote or Frostees. But as we go along the setup, I will point these out, and then you can decide what you want to use for how you want your build. And like all these builds, there is a dim link down below where you can easily set up the build in Destiny Item Manager and load the build loadout into dim for your account. But if dim isn't for you and it sounds too complicated, then you can stick around here and we'll set up the build together and go through all the options here in just a moment. So a quick example of how this build works is you'll first ideally be playing endgame PvE. You'll dodge to start the build off, which will make you invisible and trigger the Reaping Wellmaker, where getting a kill will spawn a void elemental well. Picking this up will give you damage resist as well as a bonus to weapon DPS. You'll then start killing everything and use your melee to go invisible when you need to, while also dodging the enemies to go invisible but recharging the melee one. And then because you dodged, you'll be spawning another elemental well on your next kill, and then you just repeat by chaining those abilities on a loop. As long as you dodge near enemies, you should always have an invisibility charge ready for 100% uptime, although you should never really use it constantly anyway. This build setup is with the 6 Coyote, but if you want to output the best DPS in the game on this Hunter subclass, then you'll want to use the Orpheus Rig to melt champions and bosses using an extra shot with your super. Personally, I would have this build set up with both the 6 Coyote or Frostees and then an Orpheus Rig, because you'd use the first exotic for infinite invis when you feel you need more safety over DPS, mostly being when you play solo, and then you swap to the rigs when you need more DPS, for things when you play with a team like a dungeon or raid, while still having consistent invisibility effects. But the way this build is, you'll be able to easily swap between those abilities at any given time, which won't affect the build at all. So getting into the setup of this build, and like I said, there will be a dim link below if you do want to set this up using Destiny Item Manager, so feel free to check that out. But starting with the loadout, you are only really restricted to using void weapons if you want to make the most out of Font of Might to increase DPS. Otherwise it's not really much of a problem and you can use what you want. But basing this on a master lost sector where barriers and unstoppables are living the dream, I'll be running an Arbalest to ruin the barrier's life and a void energy scout rifle to pause the unstoppables, so I can do what I want to them and cause complete suffering for about 5 seconds. And then the DPS weapon would ideally be a void heavy weapon if using the Font of Might, otherwise it doesn't really matter. Two good void energy weapons for endgame PvE though are the Funnel Web for short range and a Grid Skipper for long range gunfights. All your exotic choices with this build in terms of weapons are of course the Arbalest, Sleeper, Lament, and then Galley. These are good choices for endgame PvE, but for me I'd be sticking with an Arbalest when I'm fighting barriers, and then swapping to a Galley or Sleeper when I'm not dealing with them. For the exotic, we will be primarily using the 6 Coyote along with Orpheus Rig, and you will be able to swap between the two at any time, but we will get to these shortly. But all the best exotics you can use with this build are Graviton Forfeit, Assassin's Cowl, Frostees, and Omnioculus. You'd use this one if you're in a fire team playing something like a Grandmaster Nightfall, because this can really help your team pass pretty much anything the game throws at you. For the subclass, we are running the Void with Shadow Shot, Moebius Quiver, and then you'll want to run a Gambler's Dodge with this so that we can dodge near enemies to recharge our melee ability, and then the grenade we're going with is the Scatter Grenade since Vortex got nerfed to the ground, so this is the next best option in my opinion. The aspects we have are Trapper's Ambush, activate Quick Fall to spend your melee charge and dive to the ground, making yourself and allies invisible, invisible while also weakening nearby targets. You can also throw a smoke bomb to make people invisible as well, but the other aspect we have is Vanishing Step, where dodging also makes you invisible. Two of my favourite void aspects to use on the Hunter, and using these two aspects will give us 3 fragment slots to use. So the first fragment we have is Echo of Obscurity, where finisher final blows grant invisibility, so pretty much everything we do is just going to make us invisible. I mean, you could even just throw in a Rat King at this point and just be the god of invisibility. But the second fragment we have is Echo of Starvation, where picking up an Orb of Power grants Devour with a -10 recov, which is fine since the other fragment has given us a +10, so not really a loss or a gain. But the last fragment we have is Echo of Persistence, where those void buffs such as Invis, Overshields and Devour will last much longer. So a good set of fragments right there to use that I thought were the best to pair with this build. Now for the exotic, we are going to be going with the 6 Coyote, pretty straightforward. It gives you a second dodge charge, but we will be swapping between that and Orpheus Rig every now and again. So this one will give us the third Moebius Quiver shot, making our total damage with the tether become around 600,000 or 200k DPS, which is really good when you need that extra damage for boss fights with a team, or if you have a tanky boss when playing solo. But depending on the type of player you are for this build, you can decide to either go with extra invis or the extra DPS, but for me I'd be using both. But just make sure that you have 100 mobility regardless of what you do use. So moving towards the mods, we are going to be starting with elemental ornaments in the helmet to spawn void elemental wells randomly when getting kills with void weapons. But this is one you can swap out if you want to and use a well of utility instead. And then we have the harmonic cipher mod, and you do want to use this so that you can make the most out of the Devour. But if you're not using void weapons, then you want to use the right cipher mod so that you can consistently generate orbs, because you will need some source of getting orbs to activate Devour, otherwise you'll be wasting a whole fragment slot for something that you'll only ever use when you're playing with a team that are generating the orbs for you. But the last mod in the helmet with that is our ammo finder mod for a heavy weapon, and by the way, make sure you get 100 mobility with this build, so if you need to use stat mods then you can do so, even if it means you are using powerful friends to achieve that, but you do need 100 mobility with this build for it to be the most effective for endgame PvE. The next mod we have is Font of Might to increase the weapon DPS of our void weapons when we pick up a void well. If you're not bothered about the extra DPS, or you don't want to be restricted to using void weapons, then you can swap this out to something like the Powerful Friends or another well of utility, but we will be using our champion mod or mods with this for our gauntlets. For the chest armor we have well of utility, which stacks, so like I said you can use multiple copies of this mod, but we are using this to get extra class energy when picking up those void wells, which just means we'll get that invis even quicker, so you can dodge more than intended to keep Font of Might activated more often, while always having the invis charge ready. But we're also using our damage resist mods with this, and then in the leg armor we have Reaping Wellmaker, which will spawn the void wells when getting kills after dodging. If you don't have this, then your alternative is the elemental ornaments or the elemental ordnance, but ideally use Reaping Wellmaker if you can. And then we have the Better Already to trigger health regen when picking up orbs, and our scavenger mod for a heavy weapon. Then lastly in the class we are using a Well of Tenacity to get extra damage resist when picking up void wells, one of the best mods in the game for endgame PvE. The other two mods are optional, but I went with some ability cooldown ones, although you could use utility kickstart mods to get extra class energy for just using it. So if you are struggling to get 100 mobility, then using this is a huge help, but it will stack on top of 100 mobility to make it even better anyway. In the artifact, there's not really much I would choose for this season, but for the stats you do want 100 mobility like I said, and then 100 resilience and recovery to master this build for endgame PvE. And guys, as I said earlier, this build is the base setup, so the only thing it really relies on this season is the damage resist mods from the artifact, which you can easily replace. So I would save this build to dim as your main setup for all seasons to come, but overall this build is one of the best builds in Destiny 2 right now for the Hunter, and it's by far my favourite build because it makes playing endgame content solo so much better and easier. But guys, that is your newly updated Hunter Infinite Invisibility build for the new Void 3.0 subclass update in Destiny 2 Witch Queen Season of the Haunted. Next, as always, be sure to check out the playlist below for more top, fun and insane builds this season for 2022, and whatever you guys get up to, have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next video.